So we're going to talk about the agency problem, and you may also hear people talk about agency theory. And one of the things that's driven by this, or that drives the need for corporate governance, is this problem. So we're going to talk about corporate governance. By the way, corporate governance is basically what we do to try to ensure that our shareholders receive a return on their investment. So the shareholders are the ones that are most interested in this, and they are the ones that elect the board of directors. The board of directors are responsible for representing the interests of the shareholders, and they are responsible for hiring, compensating, and firing the managers of the firm. In fact, what they usually do is they hire the CEO, and then they allow her or him to bring in their own people for CFO, COO, and those sorts of things. Why would you want to allow a CEO to bring in their own people? Let me ask someone that plays a team sport. Who's our softball person here? If you had to play softball with a bunch of folks, would you rather play with people you know and trust and have practiced with before? Or would you rather be thrown in with a bunch of people you didn't pick? Yeah, you'd rather be dealing with your own people. When I was at Halliburton, the GE people took over, basically. And it wasn't GE corporate, it was people that used to work at GE. And who would they hire to be their subordinates? People from GE. And so I worked with lots and lots of GE people. Okay, now let's ask this question. It's the board of directors' job to fire, compensate, and hire the CEO. And now some firms, and it's true, some firms have the CEO as the chair of the board. The board is supposed to be keeping an eye on the CEO, and the CEO is now in charge of the board. Do you see what the problem is? We're back to the fox watching the hen house. Do you guys know, by the way, because I'm a country guy, I don't even know if you guys know what this means. Foxes eat chickens. I love chicken. I love chicken. But foxes especially, and by the way, do foxes pay for the chickens they take? No. And so they're basically stealing your chickens. And so you don't want to put a fox in charge of watching your hen house. You don't want to put a CEO in charge of the board of directors, because that board of directors is supposed to be taking care or keeping an eye on the CEO. Now, I'll give you an example. It comes time for compensation discussions, and I am this CEO / chairman of the board. I come in and I say, okay, folks, today I'm not here as the CEO, I'm here as the chair of the board. So I'm going to put on my chair of the board hat. Let's talk about that CEO. Isn't he a great freaking guy? I just love that guy. I think there's no amount of money we could pay him that would actually do justice to how great a guy he is. What do you think the other board members typically are going to do? Now, of course, I'm exaggerating here, right? Or are they going to say, that's total crap. That guy's an a-hole, right? No, they're not going to do that. This is one of the flaws, is that humans, that we still have these sticky interpersonal relationships. By the way, the board of directors, do you think they know the CEO socially? Yeah. Do you think maybe their kids go to the same private school? Yeah. Do you think maybe they play golf together after the board meetings? Absolutely. And so the board's likely to go along with the CEO and pay this person much more than they deserve. And when it comes time to fire the CEO, do you think the board is going to be really interested in firing their friend? No. And so what we need to do is get that CEO off the board, and of course, for sure don't have them to be the chair of the board, and that would get rid of a lot of this corporate governance problem that we see. Yes?
So is the CEO placed in that position out of ignorance sometimes, or is there a benefit to it?
You know, so the argument for doing it is, let's use Elon Musk as an example. Elon Musk basically invented this whole electric car thing that we've got going on right now. When there was still only Elon that knew anything about this, it made perfect sense to have him as both CEO and chairman of the board. Now we know he's no longer one or the other because of his weed smoking, I forget. There was something that went on there, the SEC. But the point is, there are arguments for doing that in young entrepreneurial firms that have a very specialized technology, especially if the CEO invented the technology. But for a firm like Walmart, it makes no sense whatsoever. For a firm like Bass Pro, it makes no sense whatsoever. So for people that have been around a long time and they're really not doing anything special, it doesn't make any sense at all. Thank you, that's a good question. Other questions? Okay, so let's get on to what the agency problem is. It's when people expend other people's resources differently than they would their own. Now, let's give you a personal example of this. You go home over spring break and you see your parents, and your dad says, your car is a disgrace. You need a new car. And you say, okay. And he says, tomorrow we're going to go shopping for you a new car. Now, you're driving out to the mile of cars, because every town has one, like the mile of cars. And on the way, by the way, who do you assume is going to pay for this car? So far, who are you assuming? Dad! Now, I want you to picture in your head the car that you want. Has everybody got it pictured? Okay. You're on your way to the mile of cars, and your dad says, by the way, you're paying for this car. Now I want you to picture in your head the car that you plan to buy. Did it change? Why? You don't have, and his money is not your money, right? It's not just that he's got more, it's that you didn't have to earn it. You're like, woohoo, right? And it turns out that managers do exactly the same thing with shareholders' money. By the way, the money at the firm belongs to the common shareholders. The money at the firm belongs to the common shareholders. And so anytime a manager wastes $1 of the firm's money, they are reducing shareholder wealth, which is exactly the opposite of the goal of financial management. So where does it come from? It comes from the separation of ownership and control. Let's talk about the opposite example, the sole proprietorship. If a sole proprietor wastes $1, how much does it cost her? $1, right? Now, let's move on to the partnership. My sister is in a partnership, 25% four ways, right? And whenever she wastes $1, how much does it cost her? 25 cents. Now, I love my sister, and she's actually a good person, but this is how this translates. So I'm at her house, and she's got this magnificent curved screen monitor on her computer. I don't know how it's doing it, but it looks like it's actually levitating in air. I'm like, holy crap, that must have been very expensive. And she's like, yeah, it was around $1,200. I said, damn, is that worth it? She says, I only had to pay for 1/4 of it. It impacts the way you think, even if you were a decent moral person, right? The fact that you've got this ability to spend other people's money. Now, imagine what happens when we have millions of shareholders who don't even know the CEO. By the way, at my sister's firm, the partners all know each other? And they still engage in this behavior. But how much worse would it be if the person that controlled the spending of the money didn't even know the people whose money he was spending? And that's what we see with CEOs. We have what are called atomistic shareholders. Atomistic mean there are many, many tiny shareholders, and you add them all together, and that's the value of the firm, versus concentrated ownership. The ultimate in concentrated ownership was the sole proprietor. And so the less concentration you have of ownership, the worse this problem gets. And so of all the corporate forms that we talked about, by the way, this is a good test question. Of all the corporate forms we talked about, the corporation has the biggest agency problems because it has the most atomistic ownership. It's got a bunch of tiny little owners, and none of them are able to basically control the spending of the manager. So how does the agency problem manifest itself? Well, first of all, wasteful spending. Does the corporate headquarters really need to be that big? Absolutely not. Have you seen that flying saucer thing that Apple built out in California? Billions of dollars went into that corporate headquarters. They're not even really using it all that much now because of COVID. Did it really have to be? By the way, is that the most space efficient form for a building to be? No, how about a cube, right? Or a high rise? But to make this donut flying saucer thing with all that wasted space in the middle, that's very inefficient. And so it's wasteful spending. We see it on every level when you go out on a company business and you're going to be eating on the company's dime. I guarantee you will eat differently than if you were paying out of your own pocket.
We see that a lot, like when we send folks out and going over all the expenses.
Like,
It's
wow,
like,
do you
"Oh,
eat?
you've got 3 desserts?
Oh yeah. And you can tell by looking at this person
Yeah.
that they don't eat 3 desserts with every meal or they would weigh 700 pounds, right? Oh yeah, we'll get to that in a minute. Okay, then we have, oh go ahead.
I was gonna ask how much you consider the worth of like impressing your customers.
Okay, so there's some value to that, but we can, if we say, if you're eating alone, which a lot of times on the road you are, or you're just eating with your fellow coworkers, does it matter how, no, no. It's interesting, when they send faculty from here to China, we stay in this flea bag hotel. Sometimes there's garbage under the bed. But when the higher level folks go, they stay at a different hotel, a much nicer one. And I once asked why that was, and they said, well, you know, it would be inappropriate to our hosts for us to be seen as staying at this flea bag hotel. So people will use that as an excuse, and there is some truth to it. Would you take your most valued client to McDonald's? No, only if they asked, right? One time I asked a client, I'm like, hey, go to lunch, and he says, Wendy's. I said, no problem. Okay, now we're on to empire building, and that is where you are growing the size of the company, not for the benefit of the shareholders, but for your own benefit. I'll give you an example. I interviewed with a company called Eaton, E-A-T-O-N, back in 1998. Eaton is an industrial conglomerate, and they have all sorts of industrial conglomerate type stuff like hydraulic motors and airplane parts, things that sound like the kind of similar processes to make them and maybe even similar customer bases. But they had one division that I just did not understand. And that division was the golf grips division. Does anyone here play golf? What's a golf grip?
Usually what I do is I take my left index finger and I do this.
No. Not what you do, but what are you holding on to?
Oh.
That's the golf grip, right? That rubber thing. Yeah, it's the part you hold on to so the golf club doesn't fly out and hit someone in the head, right? Okay, that's a golf grip. Now, my question to you is, what does golf grips have to do with hydraulic motors? Not one thing. Why did they buy that division?
It shows support for the employees, like stress.
She's buying into stakeholder theory here. And undoubtedly there would be scumbag managers who would say that stuff.
There's someone who likes golf.
There's someone who likes golf. The CEO's like, you know, we need to start having our board of directors meetings at Hilton Head and the old course at St. Andrews. And the general counsel says, we can't justify that. We're an industrial products company. And the CEO says, well, what if we buy a golf grips company? Oh, hell yeah, now you're talking, right? And so they did. And so then, you're going to have get-togethers to, try out the new product. Do you think they had get-togethers to try out the new hydraulic motors? No! But by golly, they're testing the fire out of those golf grips. Does that make sense? I worked for a company, and we were going to be building a factory somewhere in Europe. And so they put together a team of engineers, I didn't get to go, and sent them over, and they talked to people in all sorts of different countries, and it turns out they got the best deal from Belgium, and they came back, and they said we should build a plant in Belgium. And the CEO says, okay, it's settled then. We're going to build it in Manchester, England. Why? Well, it turns out, by the way, Manchester's in the relatively north of England, which is just south of Scotland, the birthplace of, you guys are going to say whiskey, but it's actually golf. Well, it's both, right? Golf, right? He wants to play the old course at St. Andrews, and he can go over to inspect the factory, and then just take a short train ride up to St. Andrews and play around on the old course, right? Does that make sense? Is it right? Now, fortunately, in this case, the CEO, it was a family-owned business, and so it was basically his money to waste, and that was fine. What if it wasn't? What if it was publicly owned firm? That's not good at all. Okay, so that's empire building. Now what about shirking? Does anyone know what shirking is? It's the opposite of working. You guys do it all the time and you didn't even realize what to call it, but now you know. Now it has a name. What are you guys doing? I'm shirking. Okay, now let's think about this. I had a guy that worked for me named Roy. And Roy was paid $17.88 an hour, which was big money back in 1997. And he worked by the hour. Now, this is what Roy looked like when he was working for me. This is how he walked. He's very relaxed. And he would go down to the tool crib, which is where you check out your cutting tools and whatnot. And he would talk to the guy there. Hey, how are the kids? How's the wife? Done any bass fishing lately? And he would stand there and chat as long as he thought he could get by with it. Then he would look both ways and he'd say, "Shoo, I better go before Haggard catches me." And then he moves back to his workstation. And when he's at his workstation, he's very slow. One weekend, my wife and I are out driving around and we pass Roy's house. By the way, Roy, strangely enough, he's a man in his mid-40s who races go-karts. I don't get it. But he races go-karts, so he's out there in the backyard and he's working on his go-kart. And it was amazing because this is what he looked like. He was moving. I slammed on the brakes. I said, "Honey, there's something wrong with Roy." He was moving way too fast. That's not what Roy does. Should I call an ambulance? Now, what was the difference? Who was Roy working for when he's working on his go-kart? Himself. He's getting 100% of the benefit of his efforts. At the company that I'm working at, Halliburton, how much of his benefit of his efforts does he get? He gets $17.88 an hour as long as I don't fire him. Does that make sense? And so how much effort does he put forward? He puts forth only enough not to get fired. Does that make sense? Now, should you be that way? Absolutely not. But do you think it's just hourly workers that are that way? No. Managers are that way too. And the older they get, the worse it is. And I'll explain to you why that is here in a little bit. But we talk about, and I'm there. At some point, you just want a private life, or a quiet life. You just want a quiet life. I used to want to, adventure and go off to China and do all sorts of amazing things. And now I'm like, phew, I just need a nap. And managers are the same way. We'll talk about how we handle that. So how do we control the agency problem? Well, first of all, it's through managerial compensation contracts. And that's talking about how we pay the managers. And the basic idea is we only want the managers to get rich when the shareholders get rich, because after all, the goal of financial management is, Mr. Rich, what's the goal of financial management?
Maximize shareholder wealth.
Yeah, maximize shareholder wealth. So we only want our shareholders or our managers to get rich when the shareholders get rich. And so we're going to set up their compensation contracts to do that. Are we going to give them a $1 million a year salary and that's it? No. If I paid you guys $1 million a year right now, would you work any harder than what you're currently making? Probably not. So what I've got to do is find ways to make you rich when the shareholders get rich. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, first of all, talk about stock grants. I'm just going to straight out give you some stock to get you to think like a shareholder. Give you some stock to make you think like a shareholder. And you say, wow, that's kind of rich to just give someone stock. But hey, if I give you $1 million worth of stock and it creates $30 million worth of shareholder value because of your increased efforts, it's totally worth it. And then what about stock options? Stock options are even better because they don't become valuable until the stock price hits at least a certain level. And so basically what I would do, let's say this year the stock price is $15 a share. I give you stock options that become valuable at $20 a share. And so unless you push those options up, it gives you the option to buy the stock at $20 a share. Unless you push the stock price above 20, your options are worthless. So you're going to have to work your tail off to get it up to 20. And then, let's say if you go from 20 to 21, you could actually double your money by going from 20 to 22. And so it really incentivizes the managers to increase the share price. And increasing the share price is exactly what we want them to do because of the goal of financial management. Then we have the managerial labor market. You may not think of managers being labor, but they are. Labor is anyone who trades their time for money. I know I'm standing here in a tie, but I am labor. I'm exchanging my time for money. And so managers are labor too. And there's this market where people are recruiting and hiring CEOs. Do you think that the skill of being a CEO is equally spread among the entire population? No, I can tell you right now, I would make a lousy CEO. I'd make a great COO, I'd make a lousy CEO. So what does that mean? It means that there's a small pool of people who can actually do this job. And because they're probably already CEO at a firm somewhere, there are things that are known about them. If someone does bad things at their current company, it shows up in the Wall Street Journal. So-and-so stole so much or wasted so much at this company and made these bad decisions. And now what happens when so-and-so goes back on the labor market? Does anyone want him? No, absolutely not. So what's that supposed to do? Knowing that in advance that I could be damaging my future ability to get work, I will behave myself now. You remember earlier I said the older they are, the worse it gets? What if I were 64 years old? Is this going to constrain me as much as it would constrain a 20 or a 40-year-old? Absolutely not. I've only got 1 year left anyway. By the time they figure out that I'm just sitting around, I'll already be retired. Does that make sense? But if you're 40, you're like, oh crap, I got to keep doing this. I'm 50, I got to keep doing this another 15, 16 years. That stinks. So I kind of got to keep my nose clean, right? Does that make sense? Okay. Then there's the market for corporate control. What we're talking about here is takeovers, when one firm takes over another. If you've got a company where the CEO is not doing their job, the share price is going down. And the lower the share price gets, the more likely it is someone can afford to buy your company, to take it over. What happens to CEOs when the company gets taken over typically? Yeah, they get fired. And so as a CEO, knowing that being taken over would lead you to probably get fired, you're going to do your best to keep the share price at least high enough that no one's going to take over your firm, right? And that incentive to keep the share price up is in line with the goal of financial management. And then there's monitoring. Monitoring is keeping an eye on people. If you go to London, if you go to China, you look up, you're going to see all sorts of these machines on posts and stuff. What are they? Cameras. Do you think they've got cameras to catch people doing nice things? No. They've got them there to keep you from doing, or hopefully to keep you from doing bad things. Do you think it works? When are you more, and have to look deep in your heart, you don't have to confess out loud. When are you more likely to do the right thing? When someone's watching or when you're totally by yourself? When someone's watching, we're human, right? By the way, I was given this example, Taco Bell. If you go into Taco Bell, they've got all these cameras. And they've got one camera that's pointing at the register. What is the camera in the dining room the most important one there? Absolutely not. It's the one on the register. Why?
The value.
Yeah, that's where people are doing the theft of the money. I was telling this one night in class, and a guy in the back row busted out laughing. And I said, what's funny? He says, I'm a manager at Taco Bell. I said, and? He says, the camera behind the counter at our store is the only one that actually works. Yeah, so if you're going to try to get into a drunken fight in a Taco Bell dining room this weekend, there's a good chance it won't be on film. I don't recommend it. Monitoring is important to do on CEOs. One of the ways we monitor CEOs is with these audited financial statements, right? Is it costly to hire an auditor? Absolutely. Just ask any CPA, they'll tell you. But it's worth it because we assume the waste and fraud that gets prevented is of greater value than the money we spend on that monitoring. And then, of course, there's government monitoring through the SEC. We all pay for that. But all monitoring that's worth anything is costly. Any questions? By the way, what happens? You're driving along on the highway and you see a cop car. What do? Slow down. Why? You're being monitored, right? I've been driving out in West Texas and there's nothing. How fast do you think people are driving? 90, 95, 100? No cops. Okay, now let's see here. I've got 5 minutes left, so I'm going to tell you my Bob story. When I became a salesman, I was told that I'm going to be going out with my manager, Bob, for my first visit to my customers. And I told my new colleagues, oh, that's great, because I've never sold anything before, and Bob is the master. And they laughed, and they said, that's not why Bob's going with you. I said, why is Bob going with me? And they said, well, the first night out, Bob's going to take you to an expensive restaurant, and then get you to pick up the check. Now, Bob owned 1% of the firm, because there was an employee stock ownership plan. He owned 1% of the firm. It wasn't a big firm. So that meant that every time Bob wastes $100, how much does it actually cost him? $1, right? And so we get down in Atlanta, Georgia, and Bob asked the lady at the hotel desk, where can I get a good steak? She says, do you want a good steak? Do you want a great steak? What does Bob say? I want a great steak. She says, quarter mile down the road, turn right. It's the old mill, blah, blah, blah. Okay, now, 3 ways you know you're at a good steakhouse. Number 1, everything is a la carte. What does that mean? Yeah, by itself. It's not like Longhorn where you get a potato and crap with your, it's not like that. Number 2, they have a guy that comes around with this like chrome or gold blade, and sweeps the crumbs off your table as you eat. It's really annoying, but it's a sign that's a fancy place. And number 3, they will bring you a napkin that matches your pants. We show up, I'm wearing a charcoal suit. I sit down, and the guy takes my napkin. I'm like, Bob, that bastard took my napkin. He says, don't worry, he's gonna bring you one that matches your pants. And sure enough, there he showed up with his lovely charcoal napkin, right? Okay, the server comes up. She's 8.5 months pregnant, and Bob starts to flirt with her. I'm not kidding. Now, if you don't know why that's wrong, come by, we'll talk. But here's what happened next. Bob says, what do you recommend? Now, do I have some former servers in here, or current servers? If someone asks you what to recommend, what do you recommend? The cheapest thing on the menu? The most expensive thing. Why? Yeah, she's expecting a percentage, 15, 20%. By the way, she can tell Bob's on an expense account. She assumes the tip will be higher, right? Okay, so she's willing to get Bob to waste $100 so she can get 15 or 20. Second instance of or third instance, well, we'll get to it, how many instances there are here. Bob ends up running up the tab to about $300, and the year is 2002. So that's enough money now. That was a lot of money then. Now, Bob owns 1% of the company. How much did that dinner cost him? $3. Okay, now the next question is, why do you think Bob had me pay for it on my credit card, my company credit card? I'm going to get reimbursed, not him. Why?
So you can understand why you would get friends money?
Oh, hell no. That's not the lesson he's teaching me. Who approves my expenses? Bob. Who approves Bob's expenses? Bob's boss. Bob's boss never saw that Bob was out blowing the money on this stuff because it was always Bob approved it and then sent it straight to the finance people and they just took care of it, right? Oh, yeah. And so how many scumbags do we have in this story? Well, number one, there's me, because when Bob passed the bill to me, what did I do? Oh, yeah. And did I try to slow Bob down? I don't know, Bob, don't get the manhole cover steak. Right? Number two, Bob, obviously. And number three, the server, right? Everybody here is rationally self-interested. Everyone's acting in their own best interest. And everyone is willing to incur a higher cost than someone else just so they can get a small benefit themselves. What do we call these people? Scumbags, but we also call them humans. This is the way everybody is. Now, I'm not telling you to act that way. No. Have some ethics. Have a little bit of moral fiber, right? I know marketing people are flexible in this way, but moral flexibility of marketing. Any group of people that will tell a 15-year-old boy that Axe body spray can get you action with ladies are certainly morally flexible, right?